Tonight, the U.S. and China holding high-level tariff negotiations. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent and Trade Representative Jamieson Greer both meeting with top Chinese officials in Switzerland. A source briefed on the talk.
The fading hopes of Chinese youth are shaking the Beijing regime to its core. The patience of the country's young population has run out.
Alex King owns a restaurant in Virginia that uses ingredients and supplies from China. He is hoping a deal will come together quickly, as costs for food and packaging for him have already begun to rise.
Yeah, I'm definitely frustrated about it.
Millions of young Chinese have taken to the streets, filling bridges, roads, municipal buildings, and all public spaces in opposition to the Xi government. The reason is simple. Unemployment in China is reaching record levels, and the deflationary environment is deeply damaging the country. In March 2025, the youth unemployment rate in the country rose to 16.5%. It is currently estimated that this rate has risen to 25%. Almost 1 in 4 young people is struggling to find even a minimum wage job, let alone the white-collar position they dreamed of. Youth unemployment figures fluctuate throughout the year, and the highest levels are expected in July, when the largest number of graduates enter the job market. Universities send millions of new graduates into the job market every year. However, new graduates are facing companies that have closed their doors due to the economic slowdown. Even giants like Alibaba and Tencent have slowed down hiring. Chinese youth are facing a bleak picture of long hours, low wages, and unstable contracts. The concepts of Tangping, lying down, and Bailan, giving up, which are prominent in the protests, reveal that Chinese youth no longer want to strive. This silent protest is increasingly laying the groundwork for actual protests. This is the first time since the Tiananmen incident that China has faced such a fierce youth uprising. In particular, young Chinese university students are secretly organizing themselves against the Xi government and staging protests, rallies, and mass marches in certain parts of the country. A series of marches, rallies, and demonstrations took place in Shanghai recently. These were organized by educated young people who had been forcibly sent to work in the fields over the past decade and had returned to Shanghai from different parts of the country for the Chinese New Year. The young people organized themselves spontaneously, and their activities continued for days. They gathered in front of the Municipal Revolutionary Committee offices, cut off the electricity to trams, stopped trains and traffic, and attacked government buildings and party officials. Chinese police intervened and thousands of young people were arrested. The Beijing regime appears to have ordered a harsh crackdown on the protests, but this order will not change the situation in the country. In fact, China, already shaken by the effects of economic slowdown, is now also facing U.S. tariffs. Tariffs, which have been rising since Trump took office, have put Beijing in a difficult position in the U.S., one of its largest export markets. Companies that used to sell $10 million worth of goods with a single order are complaining that this is no longer sustainable, with tariffs rising to 25 to 50%. According to some reports, the U.S. is imposing even more radical increases in tariffs, adding additional costs of 100 to 145% on some products. As a result, demand is falling sharply, Chinese factories are halting production, and millions of workers are losing their jobs. Meanwhile, state-controlled media in Beijing are suggesting that deflation could have a positive effect on the economy, which has been severely damaged by tariffs. This is being presented to China's young population as propaganda. The reason is to try to reduce protests in the country. Will it work? Deflation, or a general decline in prices, may seem good for consumers at first glance, as prices fall, but it reflects stagnation and lack of demand in the economy. Producers cut prices to sell their growing inventories, but when sales are insufficient, losses grow. Wages also tend to decline during this process, or layoffs increase. A similar picture is emerging in China. Many sectors are reporting stockpiling, inability to secure new orders, and a lack of improvement in demand, even with price cuts. Young people are the segment feeling this situation most acutely. The younger generation, who struggle to find jobs after graduation, or find jobs with unsatisfactory salaries and high living costs in big cities, are resentful toward Xi Jinping's administration. This is because they have always heard the party's propaganda that we will always grow and always be strong. Now the feeling that there is no future is creating a great sense of disappointment. When they find the opportunity, they take to the streets to protest, especially organizing mini demonstrations on campuses. These are alarm bells for Xi. Of course, as the protests spiral out of control, Beijing is tightening its measures. After all, anti-government demonstrations have been one of the most sensitive issues in China since the Tiananmen Square protests. Xi Jinping's administration is pursuing a strategy of tight control over social media to suppress mass movements at an early stage. However, this time, dissatisfaction with unemployment is so widespread that the policy of repression is turning into a powder keg that could explode at any moment. In particular, images of young people gathering after classes at university campuses and holding banners against Xi are said to have leaked to the Western media. In other words, Beijing has not been very successful in this regard so far. The voices of Chinese youth have been heard by the whole world through global platforms. Now, Mr. Xi can no longer hide the realities in his country. In addition, flash mob-style actions organized online, such as writing slogans calling for the CCP to resign on walls and quickly disappearing, are challenging security forces. Although these protests have not turned into large rallies, they are seen as a source of concern for the regime. It is no longer so easy to ignore the anger of young people and cover it up with economic dreams. Some protesters are defying the state by saying they want to obtain visas and flee abroad, claiming there is no future in China. Ultimately, the trend toward emigration aligns with the increasing brain drain in recent years. Some Chinese youth are eager to migrate to places like Europe, the US, Canada, and Australia, citing reasons such as obstacles to entrepreneurship, lack of freedom of expression, and a slow economy. The young population in the country, both university graduates and postgraduates, are applying for overseas education or immigration programs, saying, "Let me try my luck in another country." It is well known that this poses a brain drain risk for Chinese society. If the skilled human capital that the state has invested in for years leaves the country, technological and innovation initiatives will be disrupted. This situation triggers fears that more people will leave if economic growth does not continue at a sufficient rate. The Xi administration is encouraging young people to stay in the country with rhetoric that strengthens patriotic sentiment. However, young people may come to believe that if they are going to sit at home unemployed, they might as well work as waiters abroad. Despite the US's tough stance toward China, America still represents advanced technology, freedom, and high wages for many Chinese people. This dilemma clarifies the question of whether to stay in China or not, with Xi Jinping, or to test the limits of the US and Europe. The Beijing regime's view of Chinese youth remains unchanged, silencing critics, increasing internet censorship, and cracking down on protests. This preserves party discipline, but it does not solve the problems facing young people. This feeds a tension that is ripe for explosion in the long term. Steps such as easing trade relations with the US to overcome economic difficulties, structural reforms to boost domestic consumption, and youth employment programs are issues that the Xi government has not addressed in any way. Xi Jinping has emerged in recent years with a centralized leadership style and views radical reforms as risky. This dilemma raises the question of whether Xi will be forced to act if China sinks into stagnation and protests rise. Some experts argue that Xi will play the national pride card again to redirect the anger of young people toward external forces. Still, concerns over a trade war with the US may force some flexibility. In other words, Xi faces difficult choices. On the other hand, long-term unemployment of the younger generation in China could have far-reaching consequences, not only for economic growth and social peace, but also for the legitimacy and power sustainability of the Chinese Communist Party, CCP. The exclusion of the mass of youth from the labor market or an environment of persistent unemployment could undermine the CCP's decades-long balance of political stability in exchange for economic development. For a long time, the party has considered the country's development success and raising the welfare level of the people as the most important basis of its political existence, and has strengthened its legitimacy on the basis of this development story. If the younger generations begin to be excluded from this cycle of prosperity and experience prolonged and widespread unemployment, It is necessary to consider the socioeconomic, political, ideological, and propaganda dimensions of the issue in order to understand the implications for the CCP. First of all, from an economic point of view, the unemployment of the young population means an inefficient use of the competitive labor force resource. Since the 1980s, the Chinese economy has grown its exports by offering cheap and abundant labor to the world market, and in recent years has sought to make progress in technology-intensive production. If the younger generation, even with a good education, is unable to find a job or drags their feet in low-productivity sectors, the country's future push for high value-added production could be hampered. High youth unemployment rates call into question the CCP's desire to create jobs. For many years, the party has used employment growth and poverty reduction as a key propaganda plank. However, if the unemployment problem becomes chronic, faith in the success of party policies weakens. When the public asks, "Why can't you create enough jobs?" If the CCP fails to respond satisfactorily with outward or internal reforms, the erosion of governance may deepen. Second, youth unemployment has always been a risky factor in political and social stability. As we have seen in different parts of the world, if a large youth population cannot find jobs, see an economic future, and achieve personal fulfillment, social backlash is inevitable. In the case of China, even if the state's security apparatus and propaganda mechanisms are strong, dissatisfaction can spread faster on social media in the internet age. When young people's hope for the future weakens, criticism of the system may increase, and silent or open protests may be much more common. Job search dramas, especially in big cities with university graduates piling up in droves, will become more of a question of, why did we study for so many years but can't find good positions? If the CCP responds inadequately to this questioning, as we have already seen, it is very likely to choose brute force. Then a major crisis in China could be triggered all over again. This means potential social risk for the party. More concretely, prolonged unemployment will create unrest among migrant workers in the suburbs of big cities or in rural areas. If, for example, young people who are expected to enter the workforce are unable to find jobs, household incomes would fall, weakening families' spending power and undermining domestic consumption. This chain reaction effect, combined with economic stagnation, sets the stage for rising social tensions. Since the CCP's main priority is stability, scenarios such as protests or an increase in crime rates triggered by youth unemployment are of great concern to the party's top leadership. The third dimension is the relationship between party ideology and the cultural orientation of youth. In its official discourse, the CCP wants to attribute to the youth the role of bearers of national development and wants to see them as a disciplined and hard-working generation that adheres to the party line. However, long-term unemployment can foster the feeling among young people that the system does not solve our problems. If tendencies such as Tangping, lay flat, or Beilan, resignation to one's fate, stop striving, become widespread in some segments of society, the party may also perceive them as an ideological threat. For when ideals based on work, productivity, and high competition give way to passive waiting, the CCP's propaganda of "let everyone strive and the nation will prosper" loses its effectiveness. Party ideologies may worry that such currents will be reflected in the form of a backlash by unemployed youth or a hidden form of protest. In such a case, a large part of the youth may be perceived as showing passive resistance to the system, which is a negative symbolism for the party. In addition, the rapid circulation of content on social media depicting the desperation of young people could provoke an emotional public reaction. The CCP could step up censorship measures to prevent this, but this could also reinforce the perception that issues of the younger generation are being suppressed. Fourth, economic stagnation triggered by unemployment would also financially shake the CCP's local government tiers. Local governments run public services with revenues from the real estate market and industrial investment. As youth unemployment rises, consumer spending declines, small businesses may close, and the tax base shrinks. On the other hand, additional public expenditures, subsidies, unemployment benefits, training programs, etc., may be required to address the social problems caused by unemployment. Thus, the budget deficit grows, and the indebtedness level of local governments increases. While the financial imbalance of local governments is already identified as a serious risk in China, the youth unemployment crisis contributes to further increase this risk. In this case, the central government may need to step in with more bailouts, but as the economy slows, the party top leadership may feel obliged to limit this spending. Such a squeeze would make it difficult for the CCP to come up with miracle solutions. The fifth factor stems from the CCP's widespread legitimization of a balance between strong statecraft and high growth. Long-term youth unemployment shows that the system may not be able to deliver on this promise. We guarantee stability and development while limiting your participation in the political sphere, the party told the people. But if young people are unable to find their own economic future, it can be argued that a crack is forming in the legitimacy of the government. Even among the party base, there is a sense that we have to take precautions. But external and internal shocks such as trade wars, post-pandemic global recession, real estate crises, etc., narrow the room for economic maneuver. While the party's top leadership is tempted to invest in digital platforms or technology to create new lines of business, they also tend to control these platforms. In other words, there is neither full free entrepreneurship nor full public guarantee. This ambiguous order may also suppress the entrepreneurial potential of young people. The sixth point concerns foreign policy. China wants to maintain its image as a rising power. But this image may be contradicted at home by a wave of youth unemployment. The world's perception that growth is sustained thanks to hardworking Chinese youth can be undermined by long periods of unemployment. Moreover, a downturn in China's global trade is likely to disrupt production chains. An idle youth workforce could weaken its competitiveness in foreign trade or force it to increase low-paid jobs. The CCP does not want this to reflect on the outside world because economic decline or internal problems would damage party prestige. But when high unemployment becomes too obvious to hide, party propaganda can shift the blame to external factors with rhetoric such as temporary shortages or pressure from external forces. This leads to a strategy of stoking nationalist sentiments, but does not solve the concrete problem of finding a job for young people. Seventh, the special position of educated graduates. Every year in China, millions of university graduates are waiting to join the labor market. If a large number of these students remain unemployed for a long time, deeper problems will arise in their prospects for society and the party's political legitimacy. If university graduates hope to work in high-value-added sectors, but are forced by unemployment to seek work in much lower-paid or unrelated fields, the perception that the gap between the party leadership's modernization rhetoric and reality is widening is reinforced. This may increase the tendency for brain drain in the future. Some young people may choose to move to other countries and pursue careers there. This would undermine China's ambitions for technological and scientific development in future generations. The CCP may see this as betrayal or ideological deviation, but the problem is rooted in economic inefficiency and cannot be solved by repression or restrictions. Eighth, the potential for radicalization of unemployed youth. This radicalization does not necessarily mean political dissent or street protest, but sometimes a turn to the underground economy, an increase in digital currency fraud, illegal trade, or other anti-systemic activities. The anger of unemployed youth may erupt in a different form, although government security services may try to intervene. The CCP worries that such fluctuations could jeopardize the integrity of the country, so it may strengthen its policing methods. But this could create a new cycle of repression and, in the long run, limit economic recovery. Ninth, a natural consequence of youth unemployment is the tendency to delay marriage and childbearing. Already, China's birth rate has been declining in recent years. With young people unable to find jobs and lacking financial security, marriage plans are postponed, and the desire to start a family declines. This would accelerate a demographic crisis in China, where the population is getting older, as the proportion of the working-age population continues to shrink. The burden on the pension and social security system increases, even if the CCP announces birth incentive packages to address the aging of the population. The problem of how young people will pay for child-rearing if they are unemployed remains unclear. The party is thus in a difficult situation, both economically and demographically. On the 10th and final point, we can consider possible recovery scenarios. When global trade conditions improve, or when the CCP is actually able to revitalize the domestic consumption-driven economy, it can implement serious projects to reduce youth unemployment. For example, it is possible to create new job opportunities for thousands of young people in areas such as the digital economy, artificial intelligence, green energy, and infrastructure. But their impact may not be felt in the short term and will require integrated planning with education programs, capital investment decisions, and regulations. If the CCP manages this well, if it can offer young people an economic future again, the party's legitimacy can emerge stronger. But if it fails, the worsening spiral of unemployment will deeply undermine trust in the party, and the relationship between party and society will become more fragile in the long run. All in all, a scenario in which China's young population faces prolonged unemployment is a scenario of high economic and political risk for the CCP. The legitimacy based on economic development may crumble, the youth may turn into a lost generation, social unrest or silent opposition may accumulate, and the party ideology may lose credibility with the youth. Considering that millions of young people enter the working age in the country every year, the accumulation of unemployment could be considered a major threat to the CCP's model of stability and development. The administration's policies to prevent this may bring temporary relief, but global trade headwinds and domestic market constraints may bring new challenges. In the long run, youth unemployment will become one of the most critical tests of governance for the party, challenging the social contract of the CCP. Meanwhile, whether U.S. tariffs will continue is decisive for both the global economy and China's future. Some U.S. politicians say tariffs should remain in place unless China stops intellectual property theft and unfair trade practices. Another group argues that high tariffs are hurting U.S. consumers and driving up inflation. There are still strict customs barriers against China in many sectors. Therefore, Beijing cannot hope for a return to normalcy in the short term. If tariffs are not lifted and China cannot regain its market share, youth unemployment and deflationary trends will continue. It will be difficult for China to protect its export model forever, and it needs to achieve an economic transformation based on consumption and the service sector. However, this transformation will take time. If youth protests escalate during this process, the political direction of the country could change. Add to this the fact that U.S. tariffs will continue, and Xi will find himself in a situation from which there is no way out. So, what is the latest situation on the U.S.-China tariff front? The U.S. and China remain deadlocked in their customs war. Neither side appears willing to back down. Following U.S. President Donald Trump's decision in early April to impose high customs duties of 145% on Chinese imports, China responded by imposing customs duties of 125% on U.S. goods. U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent said that it is up to China to de-escalate the tension. Meanwhile, the Chinese Foreign Ministry said that the two sides have not held talks. The possibility of economic separation between the world's two largest economies is no longer mere speculation. The economic costs to China are undeniable. The loss of reliable access to the U.S. market, combined with increasing uncertainty in the global trading system, has dealt a blow to China's export-oriented sectors. China's comparative advantage lies in its large production base and tightly integrated supply chains. This is particularly true for high-tech and green industries, such as electric vehicles, batteries, and solar energy. These sectors are deeply dependent on open markets and predictable demand. New trade restrictions on electric vehicles from China and Europe, Canada, and the U.S. have led to a significant decline in demand. China's GDP growth was 5.4% in the first quarter, higher than expected. But analysts anticipate that the impact of tariffs will soon be felt. Additionally, this week, a key measure of factory activity in China showed a contraction in manufacturing. China's economic growth has also been dragged down by structural headwinds, such as industrial overcapacity, an aging population, rising youth unemployment, and persistent regional disparities. The real estate sector, once a pillar of the country's economic rise, has become a source of financial stress. Local government debt is rising, and a pension crisis is looming. Negotiations with the U.S. to end the trade war may be desirable. However, Beijing's unilateral concessions are neither feasible nor politically acceptable. On the other hand, Trump's trade wars have not only strained bilateral relations, but also shaken the foundations of the global trading system. By sidelining the World Trade Organization and adopting a transactional approach to bilateral trade, the U.S. has weakened multilateral norms and emboldened protectionist tendencies worldwide. An unexpected consequence of this instability has been the revival of regional arrangements. In Asia, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, supported by China and focused on the ASEAN bloc in Southeast Asia, has emerged as a reliable alternative for economic cooperation. Meanwhile, the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement continues to expand with the United Kingdom's accession late last year. In Latin America, regional blocs are also seeking new paths to integration in the hope of protecting themselves from the shocks of resurgent protectionism. However, regionalism is not a panacea. This system cannot replicate the scale or efficiency of global trade, nor can it restore the predictability that exporters depend on. The greater danger is that the world is being dragged into the Kindleberger trap, where no power emerges to provide the leadership needed to sustain global public goods or a stable trading system. It was not the existence of conflict that led to the systemic collapse of the global economy, but the absence of leadership. Without renewed global coordination, the economic fragmentation triggered by Trump's tariff wars could lead to something far more dangerous than a recession, escalating geopolitical and military tensions that no region can control. The political landscape is already tense. For example, the Chinese Communist Party has long tied its legitimacy to the promise of ultimate reunification with Taiwan. Still, the costs of using force remain extremely high. One of the issues that China's young population opposes and is angry with Xi over is the Taiwan crisis. This is because, in an extreme scenario, a large number of young Chinese could be drafted into the military, which would be an even more tragic outcome for them. If Beijing continues to insist on its position on Taiwan, the scenario we have described is not impossible. However, China is neither capable nor inclined to assume the role of global leader on its own. The current focus is more on domestic priorities, such as sustaining economic growth and managing social stability, than on foreign policy. However, Beijing can still play a constructive role in shaping the international environment by cooperating with Europe, ASEAN, and the Global South. Paradoxically, a more coordinated effort by the rest of the world could bring the U.S. back into the fold. Washington may rediscover the strategic value of engagement and return not as a sole leader, but as an indispensable partner. In the short term, other states may seek to gain advantage from the great power rivalry, but they should not forget that what begins as a conflict between giants can quickly draw in spectators. In this volatile landscape, the way forward does not lie in exploiting disorder. On the contrary, nations should cautiously advance their shared interest in re-establishing a stable, rules-based global order. The Chinese side, however, instead of taking such systems into account, is making decisions that will further destabilize the country's economic balance, using repression as a primary means of prevention, and completely ignoring the voices of its citizens. At the root of all this lawlessness lies Xi's confidence in himself. Xi believes that he will remain at the helm of China for years to come, that he can easily quell the rebellions of the young population, and that the deflationary environment in the country and U.S. tariffs will not affect his power. However, Xi Jinping is in political trouble. The leader of the People's Republic of China is facing challenges from many groups, including retired members of the Politburo Standing Committee, his princeling friends, some high-ranking military officials, and even some members of the country's middle class. His ability to shape policy in the financial, foreign, and other areas has been curtailed. It may be very difficult to predict whether Xi, who is considered the eternal core of the party, will be removed from office this year. But it is very important to understand who his enemies are and how they are challenging the commander-in-chief. The PLA Daily, the official newspaper of the People's Liberation Army, has recently defended the virtues of collective leadership. Xi Jinping's grip on China's economic policy appears to be weakening. Key policy platforms like the Central Financial and Economic Affairs Commission and the Central Commission for Deepening Comprehensive Reforms have stopped meeting regularly. This comes amid the ongoing flood the market with money stimulus campaign launched in September, which has had limited impact on China's economic downturn. Facing sluggish exports and the retreat of multinational firms, Xi has also softened his confrontational wolf warrior diplomacy, signaling a temporary pivot to improve ties with the West. However, his internal control remains strict. Senior retired officials critical of his economic and foreign policies have been placed under travel and meeting restrictions, with their staff replaced. Even so, Xi's symbolic gestures, such as sitting alongside critics like Wen Jiabao and Li Ruhuan during National Day events, suggest he may be acknowledging growing dissent within the CCP elite. Xi's sidelining of other political princes has earned him enemies both within China and abroad, many of whom have since settled overseas and may be collaborating with foreign intelligence agencies. While it's unclear what information they may have, it poses a lingering threat to Xi's position. Domestically, dissatisfaction is rising. Policies favoring state-owned enterprises, youth unemployment, and the ongoing economic slump have fueled discontent. Many in the middle class are emigrating, while thousands of low-income Chinese are attempting to flee via Central America. Meanwhile, local government debt continues to spiral, worsened by a January 2025 decision to let wealthy regions issue bonds without central approval. The biggest unknown now is China's youth. Facing a bleak future, they may soon be forced to choose between protest and exodus, either challenging Xi's rule head-on or leaving the country altogether.